All right, so let's talk about Starbucks. We've had some of the people you've written about on several times. Jazz Brizek, I think, has been on two or three times, and Michelle Eisen. They were out of that first sort of Starbucks up in Buffalo. But why Starbucks for you? In walking through this sort of story in this trying to show people their ability to unionize?
Yeah, so just taking a step back, well, why should we care about Starbucks? Well, we should care about Starbucks because the fundamental issue facing working people in the crisis of our country at this point is that there's far too few workers in unions. So the book is an attempt to address, like, how would you actually organize millions of workers into unions, which is the precondition for stopping Trumpism, ending climate catastrophe, and all of this. And so what Starbucks shows, like some of the other drives that I profile, is a new form of union organizing that has the capacity to scale up to millions. There's a lot of good labor organizing that happens in the US, but the problem is because it's so staff intensive, it just can't reach the number of workers necessary. It's just literally there's not enough time and money to be able to organize large enough groups of workers. So what Starbucks did is it built a new model in which it relied far more on workers to do the types of things that staff normally do. And so it was able to spread virally. But what happened, is listeners might remember, is they won one union election in Buffalo. Hundreds and then eventually thousands of workers all across the country started flooding the email inbox and saying, well, how did you do that? We want to do it too. If it had been a traditional campaign, they literally would have had to stay with their initial plan, which was just to organize locally. They had no initial plans to organize nationally because they had so few resources. This was all sort of building the plane as they flew it. And so they had to pivot to something really dramatically new. And they actually built this new model in practice before they'd even theorized it. And they started having the workers themselves who had won this union election in Buffalo and start organizing, get on Zoom calls and essentially talk through what they had done with workers all across the country. And it was the only way they could do it, because if they had tried to rely on staff, they just wouldn't have been able to have enough conversations and enough support. So that is the basic reason why we should care about Starbucks as far as a model. But then on the merits of Starbucks itself, well, I think the basic reality is Starbucks is the sixth largest private employer in the United States. You're talking about over 200,000 workers. You're talking about, if workers unionize Starbucks, this will be the single most important union election, union first contract since the 1930s. There hasn't been a major breakthrough at sort of the heart of corporate America, really since the 1930s, early 1940s. And so what we're talking about is, if workers can show that not only are they able to win in things like journalism and higher ed, but take on the biggest corporations, defeat them despite the most intense union busting, right? The companies spent hundreds of millions of dollars just to terrorize and destroy workers. And they're very close right now to winning a first contract. So it's this amazing test case for the new model, but then also showing that, labor should be raising its ambitions. If this small group of workers could initiate a national campaign that's able to take down one of the biggest companies in the world, then it shows that all labor unions should really be putting real resources into serious organizing, particularly on a bottom-up level.
All right. So first off, and we should say, when you say staff, you're talking about, like, often what happens with a unionization project like this is that people will go to a union to try and get a sponsorship, essentially. And in this instance, I think most unions would have said, like, it's too difficult. You've got workers, you got 6 workers in Buffalo. And then, then you got 10 people in Syracuse. And then we got, it's just too hard, too disparate in that way. It's almost like the only way it could have worked with people who weren't aware of how difficult this could be.
Yeah, I think that's right. And unions are famously conservative, and not in the political sense, although sometimes the political sense, but just conservative in the sense that these are not risk-taking institutions. And so the idea of taking on one of the biggest companies in the world with so few resources would have just struck most unions as lunacy. And in fact, that is the norm. One of the issues we have in the labor room is unions systematically say no to workers when they reach out. It's almost the norm. The unions are very picky and choosy about what drives they'll take on, because they tend to be quite expensive. Fortunately, these Starbucks
everybody
workers
is like that. I mean, to be fair, to be fair, no, I mean, like, this is the case with almost every single institution that exists. I mean, honestly, like, it is rare to find any type of institutions that are, like, not risk averse short of like, billionaires like the Mercers who are willing to just chuck out money to any anti-union or any right-wing project there is. But for the most part, people are afraid of expending resources in a way that's not going to work.
Yeah, you're right. This is sort of a classical sociological dilemma, is that the bigger your organization gets, the more you have to lose, so the more risk averse you get. So you're right. It's not just unions, but unions are maybe even worse culprits for a variety of reasons, because they're going up against the biggest and most powerful opponents too. So it's not just a risk in general. It's like them doing this is just poking the bear. So a lot of unions are sort of understandably reluctant to poke the bear. But for that exact reason, historically and still today, the forces that have been willing to take that risk have tended to be young people and young leftist workers, young radicalized workers. For political reasons and for personal reasons, they have less familial responsibilities. So if they get fired, it's not quite the same risk. And then honestly, if you believe that a better world is possible and billionaires should not exist, and maybe you've had experience, maybe you volunteered for the Bernie campaign, maybe you went to a Black Lives Matter protest. This is the milieu that all across the country has been driving this bottom-up upsurge. And for them, the risk factor is a little bit different, because they want to change the world, and they understand that there are risks, but that they're willing to take that. And it's been those workers at Starbucks and elsewhere that have really driven things forward.
Last year was a record number of petitions to start new unions, is my understanding, at least in modern times.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. We've had record numbers on that, and we had over 100,000 workers join a union through organizing last year, almost the same number a year before, and just a little bit less. So you're talking in the span of just the year prior. So you're talking about over 300,000 workers unionizing in this bottom-up way, primarily just over the last few years. This isn't a small army. This is not an insignificant number of people who now are building power against some of the biggest companies on earth. It hasn't been enough to turn around the whole country yet, mostly because unions haven't been investing in this as they should. It's sort of workers have had to do it despite the lack of overall support of unions. But you see how even in this unfavorable terrain, because even under Biden, the law was still really stacked against workers. The NLRB was good, but they were still systematically firing workers, ignoring the law because there's so few sort of repercussions for breaking law.
Starbucks seems to be shutting down a lot of stores still where there's union activity, it feels like.
Yeah, they've started this again. The major check on them isn't really the law, but is public backlash. And so insofar as their brand is in serious jeopardy, if not already extremely tainted, then this has put some of a block. The worst of their union busting has been checked for now, which is good. It shows that the company's on the retreat. They're meeting with the workers. They actually have brought in a mediator. So the worst of the union busting at Starbucks for the time being has been put on pause. And it shows that the workers do have power. And they're on the process of winning.
It also shows to me that people don't want to share their blankets like they did in the Warsaw Ghetto. I don't know if you remember that, Howard Schultz. I mean, that will always stay with me. Howard Schultz admonishing Starbucks workers to be more like people in the Holocaust. Sort of might have wanted to sort of think out that metaphor a little bit as to who were the people in the Warsaw Ghetto. In his scenario, it was his workers. And ostensibly, he was the Nazi guards, I guess. Anyways.
And it is funny that one of the nice things about unionization is that it sort of brings to light how just actually dumb in many ways these CEOs are. There's just a genuine obliviousness to the sort of realities of working people that when you sort of pull them out of their boardrooms, you're like, oh, this person shouldn't be allowed to talk to the public and talk to working people.
It is fascinating. That was one of the most insightful his complete inability, his overestimation of his ability to be in touch with these workers was so I think illustrative of what was problematic at these things and the dynamic that goes on, right? He really thinks he knows these people. And he has no idea, none. Contrast what happened at Starbucks, which was a completely there was no union. And some people started in Buffalo and they basically grew one with what happened with the UAW, because it's still from a bottom up type of situation, but one happens in the context of a pre-existing institution.
Yeah, it's worth noting there was a little bit of union support in the Starbucks case, but you're right that the overall is really grassroots driven. In the case of the UAW, it's true that the union supported, but it's worth just flagging the prehistory, which is that the UAW until very recently was like the worst, most corrupt, most top-down union, and workers had to take over their union. So the bottom-up aspect started with workers running a slate to kick out the old leadership, electing somebody named Sean Fain, who listeners probably are aware of now, and taking back their union. That then in turn set the stage for extremely successful strike at the big three, won massive raises. And what the UAW did, which was so smart, which most unions don't do, is they understood the importance of attention and momentum. And so at this moment, when the whole eyes of all of the auto workers and really all of the country was watching them win and sort of massively defeat these companies, they said, okay, now that we have the spotlight on us, we're going to call on every auto worker across the whole country to start unionizing. Because the basic problem in auto is that you have the North unionized, but most of the new plants are in the South, and nobody's been able to unionize the South for ever. None of the major plants until just last year were unionized. They said, okay, we're going to seize this moment. We call on all workers to start self-organizing. We're going to give you the tools and support you need. And sure enough, within a few months, they had won the first union election ever in the South. They won Chattanooga and Tennessee at Volkswagen, and then they spread to Mercedes. And you see now still all across the country, auto workers are organizing and they're running more elections. And so you can see then there's ways of doing this bottom up organizing that do lean on existing union resources. And I think actually part of the argument I make in the book is you need that. If we're going to organize millions and millions of workers, you need unions putting real resources into bottom up organizing. So we shouldn't see them as mutually exclusive, sort of rank and file versus the union, but rather we need unions to be organizing in a different way, to be giving tools and support for workers to start self-organizing and to be able to organize at scale. And I think the UAW is showing how that can be done.
What is happening since the Mercedes plant? And I'm also thinking in terms of like, we just had an Amazon warehouse, I think it was in Nashville, that voted not to unionize. So I'm wondering, when I look at like where unionization is happening, it doesn't feel like it's happening as much in industrial settings as much. I mean, in terms of like expansion, or in sort of more like in warehouse. It's more like public facing things, baristas, teachers. People where there is a more of a connection with the public.
Yeah, it's a good question. I dig into the numbers of this a bit in the book. It is also the case that the bottom up organizing has spread to sort of more blue collar work that isn't as public facing. It hasn't gotten the same amount of media attention, but the biggest win, think about Amazon. One of the biggest wins recently was Amazon, and that's at a warehouse that isn't public facing. And actually, we've seen in Amazon just over the last few months, even under Trump, a significant increase in the amount of organizing. There was a national strike during Christmas. And so the organizing at Amazon is actually spreading and is deeper than it's ever been. But you pose a real question, which is, how would you organize the rest of these industries? I would say it's just worth keeping in mind that the political economy we're in is that the vast majority of people work in like service and public facing jobs at this point. So it's not that surprising. This is where the overall majority of people work. And also a lot of hard industry is still union. So there's like in the North, for instance, the big factories tend to be unionized already. It's in the South that where the factories are not as organized. And, the warehouses of Amazon are one of the big targets. But it's not that surprising that most of the organizing has been in retail and in, education and in hospitals, because that's just frankly where most people work. And I think sometimes there's a romanticization of blue collar work, which doesn't exactly fit with the political economy we're in. It's not like all of the workers are there. We need to be organizing all workers, but it's actually, it's a good thing that the vast majority of workers are organizing wherever they're at. I think what you mentioned though is real, that the terrain is harder though for workers without that public support. I think they feel more isolated, and particularly in the South, where the political sort of establishment is so against them. These are hard places to organize. There's a reason that they haven't organized to the same numbers as elsewhere. And so it's going to take a lot more resources. And frankly, it's going to take sort of more of a national upsurge for large numbers of workers to join in. It's not the case that you're just going to convince all of them through one-on-one conversations. These things tend to grow in moments and spurts. And, we're seeing that type of spurt right now in the federal sector under Trump. And we don't know when exactly that spurt is going to sort of explode at Amazon. So you have to keep on with that organizing. And then eventually it sort of breaks through like it did at Starbucks or like it did in the federal sector right now.
I want to talk about federal workers and particularly also I want to talk about EWOC because I think that's it's a great organization. I think it'd be very helpful for folks in our audience who are wondering what's the first step that they take. But is there, to the extent that there is a broad union strategy and there are people thinking about it on those terms, right? Like I imagine, Sean Fain is thinking about it. I imagine, I don't know if O'Brien is thinking about something like that as much as he is, thinking about like his next plane ride in Air Force One or whatever it is. But I imagine there are people who think about that and assess it. And where are the sectors that people are thinking, or let me step back from that. Are there ideas out there that we need to, this sector, either from an industry perspective or a type of worker perspective or a regional perspective, this is where we need to really focus our efforts, because if we unionize this state or these different states, it's going to catch on. Or if we unionize this industry or these shops, it's going to catch on. Are there people thinking like that, or is it more like we're following where the energy is?
Well, yeah, this is how I would say. First of all, the unfortunate reality we're in is that basically union density in the private sector is 6%. It's 10% in the workforce as a whole. So what this means is the vast majority of industries are non-union at this point, right? So there's so much terrain to grow in almost all industries that there is a necessity essentially for the unions in these different sectors to go big in all of these different sectors. We don't actually have the sort of luxury of just picking and choosing one or two key sectors. And that also does reflect a change in the political economy. Whereas in the 1930s, you could just really focus on hard industry. The nature of the economy is sort of disaggregated and is much more diverse. So it's such that there isn't this one sort of linchpin that if you take down, takes out everything. People suggest that might be Amazon. There's some truth to this. The difficulty is that Amazon is extremely powerful, and you're probably going to actually need a much broader movement and a lot of time before you're able to take down Amazon. So I'm skeptical that you just sort of organize Amazon and then everybody else. My guess is Amazon will be sort of one of the last pins to fall, as it were. And I do think that the necessity is for a very broad-based labor movement to be scaling up everywhere. But within the industries, right, if you're talking about within specific industries, well, then, yeah, there's specific targets you should be focusing on, right? So you should be focusing in healthcare on the biggest non-union sort of HMOs and these different healthcare chains. Within the private sort of retail sector, you need to be organizing Walmart. You can't just be organizing Starbucks and Amazon. Walmart is still the biggest private employer. So you have particular targets within these different industries that have to be sort of a linchpin. And I think part of the issue has been that the labor movement has had its expectations so low and its resources so low for so long that even thinking about doing a big target and a big campaign is sort of outside the wheelhouse or the sort of sense of what's possible for most top union leaders. So again, it's going to come up to these workers from below to take initiative. What about workers? Workers can go salt, which means you just get a job at a non-union place. They did that at Starbucks. They did it at Amazon. They can do that at Walmart. They can do that in these hospitals. And you're starting to see that now. So I think it's going to be more, this is the dynamic where workers from below show proof of concept, win a union election in one of these big companies, like we saw at Whole Foods. They won that despite the labor movement as a whole wasn't investing in Whole Foods. Workers themselves took the initiative. They beat Amazon despite a just horrific union busting campaign. They showed it was possible. That in turn is the type of thing you're going to need to force the union leadership, which for the reasons we discussed are really risk averse, to take the big organizing initiatives that right now, frankly, they're not really talking about it. Most of them aren't even talking seriously about like plans to defeat Trump. The level of institutional inertia and lack of strategy in labor would be hard to exaggerate.
Wow. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.